I'd like to kick us off with a few numbers. In Africa, a quarter of the population lives in countries where food prices increased by more than 20% last year. If we look at Ghana, the consumer price index for most households was more than 100%, with food prices being the most affected. Now, if you combine this with the fact that most African households spend a high share of their income on food, that's quite staggering. In Norway, this share is 13%, which is one of the lowest in Europe. In Kenya and Nigeria, by contrast, it is almost 60%. What is driving this? COVID, Ukraine, the sovereign debt crisis, all exacerbated by the impacts of climate change. Is it a kind of perfect storm? COVID infections, they were higher in this part of the world, in industrialized countries, but the economic impacts were harder in emerging markets. And of the impact of the war in the Ukraine, the president of Ghana said that the bombs may be falling far away, but they're hitting us in Africa. On the sovereign debt crisis, there was an article in The Economist just 2 weeks ago which said the following: public debt to GDP across Africa has climbed to its highest level in 2 decades. The average cost of servicing external debt now consumes 17% of government revenues, which is the highest since 1999. And on climate, a report that was released in April by the World Weather Attribution Group found that the current drought in the Horn of Africa was made 100 times more likely by climate change. These numbers paint a dark picture, even a heartbreaking one, perhaps. And in a situation like this, we need to take a step back and ask ourselves, where are the opportunities for us to make a difference in this situation? So we'll be exploring the following questions in our panel today. What does this look like on the ground in Norfund's African markets? How is it impacting the companies in our portfolio? And what does it mean for us as an investor? How can we invest to make a difference? Now, you may think that I'm biased, but I am certain that there is no one better to help us explore these questions than our 3 African regional directors in Norfund. Our first one, Pindi Nyandoro, she is the regional director for Southern Africa. Please, Pindi. And we have live with us from Accra, Nana Winful-Finn, our regional director for West Africa. Hi, Nana. And last but not least, we have William Nyoke, who is our regional director in East Africa, live with us from Nairobi. But of course, there's also a lot of expertise in this room, and we do encourage you to send questions, reflections, and comments by using Slido, which will soon appear here on the screen. You can use a QR code. I can't promise you that we'll get to all of your questions, but I will see some of them here and try to bring them into the conversation. So let's start with the situation on the ground. And William, I'd like to kick it off with you. The numbers that we introduced this panel with, they're quite dark and gloomy. But can you say something about how this is translating into the situation on the ground? How is it affecting people and societies from your viewpoint in Nairobi?
Thank you very much, Eva, and good afternoon, everyone. I think this question is relevant today as it was a year or so ago. We just woke up to headlines in the newspapers in Kenya that we should prepare to pay more for food in June. And these are basic foods like cereals, cooking oil, sugar. I happened to have been in the village visiting my in-laws over the weekend. And, I spoke with some people about how this is affecting him on the ground. And I met an old man who has never bought grains over the last 10 years or so because he's been producing enough to feed himself and his family. But this time around, he told me that he's been buying grains since January because the harvest that the produce that he got last year was not enough to take him to the next season. And the reason is because of the high cost of inputs, this is fertilizer and seeds. He could not cultivate enough land that he's been doing in the past. And for that reason, he just got enough to get him half the year. Well, that means that he has to spend more of his income that he would have spent on other things to buy basic foods to feed his family. And I think that that kind of story is spreading across many families in these markets, that prices are not coming down, production is lower, cost of inputs are quite high, imports are even more expensive in some instances, and therefore, the disposable income of an average consumer in Kenya or East Africa today is actually getting worse, or not enough to take care of families. And I think when we read these kind of headlines in the morning, on a day like this, when we think that maybe we should get some easing on inflation, it becomes more disheartening. But I think this story is spread across most of our regions.
Yeah, it's a story that really illustrates the challenge, isn't it? That you have higher prices on inputs, fertilizers and seeds, means that you can produce less, and that forces you to buy more at higher prices. So a very challenging situation, well illustrated there. Nana, moving over to you in Accra and Ghana, what does this look like in West Africa?
I mean, it's been a roller coaster 18 months or so, as you talked about, Ilva. Today, headline inflation is at 41%, reported, down from about 54% last year. Food inflation is at 49%, but as you talked about, if you ask most households, what we're feeling is closer to 100%. Our troubles culminated in a default on Treasury bonds and an IMF bailout in May, and we have to look forward to a couple of years of austerity measures where we expect that the prices of all items will increase, right? And the government, in a bid to increase revenues, will increase the prices of tariffs, will increase taxes across the board, etc. Today already, a 5-liter bottle of cooking oil that we used to buy in my household beginning of last year at about 100 Ghana cedis sells at 300 Ghana cedis as of yesterday. So this is real. I often wonder what the average person on the street who works a blue-collar job, for example, is doing. And what we're told is that what people are doing to compensate is for themselves and their families, rather than have 3 meals a day, people are having 1 meal a day. And it's been, as of now, 18 months of this and counting. Of course, with the IMF bailout, we will see things improve to some extent for a bit. But I think the key question becomes what we do to address the structural issues that led to this to begin with. Things are not much better in Nigeria, where reported inflation is at 22%, food inflation at 25%. There's a fuel subsidy in the market that was removed just on Friday, and overnight fuel prices have shot up 3 times. So just do the math and how that translates then into the prices of everything, in particular for food. So what we have seen in the market over the last few months, year and a half really, is a significant reduction in wealth of people across the board. We've also seen for companies, based on the increases in their costs of production, tariffs, production costs, etc., significant value destruction. And this is the kind of thing that gives you pause. We are fundamentally, in all of the region, at heart, optimistic people. But some days it's hard to be optimistic. It feels a bit like 2 steps forward, a step back.
I can see that. It's not just headline numbers on a page, but it's really translating into real issues on the ground for individuals and for companies. I think the point on companies, that gives us a nice segue perhaps over to you, Pindi. If we can turn now from thinking about the impact on people and societies and look more at the portfolio companies. How are the companies in our portfolio impacted by this? How are management teams reacting? How are employees affected by the situation that we're now seeing with a Southern Africa lens on?
I think if you look at Southern Africa, you actually find that companies like 260 Brands in Zambia, they've actually benefited, for lack of a better word. I think what you find is that they've had a bit of a double whammy in that soya chunks. So they're into low-cost protein feeding, and the soya chunks, soya has actually gone up. But on the other hand, because consumers have downgraded from animal protein like fish and meat to plant protein, the volumes have actually gone up. So they've actually been able to counter some of the increase in soya prices with the volumes. Having said that, because the problems that Nana and William have referred to are also being experienced in Southern Africa, as far as the purchasing power of consumers is concerned, if those prices continue to go up over, we're certainly going to see further downgrade. And that further downgrade for companies like 260 Brands will mean that people will move to things like maize, which is the staple food in Southern Africa, and bread. Having said that, however, I'd like to just touch on Malawi to say over and above imported inflation, because a country like Malawi actually imports most of their food, they've had to contend with floods in the past few months. And the floods happened at a time when the maize crop was actually in the ground. So that was destroyed, which means they have to import food as well. And that's diverting money that could have gone to the health sector. And to just add for the audience that we have to bear in mind that these governments, not just in Southern Africa, but the whole African continent, actually don't have the fiscal space to be able to help with comprehensive, how can I put it? Like coming in to help the consumers in those markets. They just don't have this fiscal space to do that. So they're highly reliant on NGOs. And listening to what you said initially about the impact in countries like Norway, one can't help but feel that the amount of help we can expect from NGOs is also gone down.
And we're seeing, right, that you're saying the government doesn't have the fiscal space, and with the increase in cost of servicing external debts, of course, there will be less money available for education and health and other essential services. We have one question coming through here, and perhaps I could send that one over to you, William. Given all the agri-potential in Africa, why have I been eating chicken from Brazil while in Mozambique, or rice from Thailand while in Tanzania? So perhaps you could take the East Africa perspective on this. Thai rice in Tanzania, why is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting question, and we are struggling with the same questions as well. We even import eggs sometimes. But I think because of the global trade, I mean, it's been very easy to import things from everywhere and anywhere. I think we became a bit complacent as a continent, that we could get things cheaply from across the world, until it dawned on us that actually these trade routes can be closed, and all of a sudden we don't have means to provide food, which is very basic. I was in Tanzania two weeks ago, actually, and the thinking is changing. If you look at countries like Ethiopia, which maybe 18 months ago probably was importing wheat. I think the last season or the last two seasons, they've ramped up their wheat production to the extent that they're now almost self-sufficient and thinking of starting to export. I think the crisis, or the triple crisis that we've experienced over the last few years, have actually woken up the continent to some extent. What we need are investments. From my point of view, I think we need to invest in inputs that I mentioned in the past. We need to invest in production so that we can produce our food here. The land is there, the labor is there. Really what is lacking is capital in some cases, and technology or know-how, which we can import from other countries. So I think if you look going forward, my optimism is that given that the challenges that we're experiencing today, a lot of these things are going to change. And I just want to add very briefly, what I've also seen is people are trying to go back to traditional foods that we used to eat before maize and wheat came to us, and cassava and things like potatoes are being blended with wheat flour to produce the same similar foods that we are otherwise eating, just from wheat, right? So I think, to answer that question, yes, that has been the experience, and we've learned. And I talk a lot with people in governments. People have learned a lot from very good lessons from
Right.
this crisis.
Thanks,
And I think
William.
going forward, we need to see more investments going into production.
Yeah. Can I just ask our kind producers to make sure that I have a clock ticking here so I don't run too much over time? Otherwise, that might happen because this is super interesting. Nana, if we can come back to you and West Africa and the impact on portfolio companies. I know that Sundry, one of our investments in Nigeria, has been feeling some of this. What does that look like?
Absolutely. So for context, for those in the audience, Sundry Foods is a leading quick service restaurant chain that provides local, good quality, affordable food to the masses, typically served buffet style, and also baked goods to the masses. One of the things that is distinguishable about this company is that it does a lot of local sourcing already. And that was the case even at the point we invested. Now, that has helped in these times. However, even within that context, based on the fact that you have a security issues in many of the growing or producing parts of the country where these inputs come from, specifically rice, animal proteins like chicken, and some maize, even though that's largely imported, as well as climate change, which Ilva talked about, which is changing patterns and reducing yields in general. What we're seeing is that they are having significant increases in the prices of their inputs, both imported as well as locally sourced. And so the company has tried to, as an example, sort of the three biggest ones, rice has increased in price by about 25%, the locally produced, over the last year. Animal proteins, where you have an existing demand-supply gap as well as spiraling prices, you can imagine the impact of that. And then on wheat, as I talked about, it's imported. So it goes to the point that William was making before about the effects of the Ukraine war. What the company has tried to do is to further broaden and buttress its supply chain locally. So where it was already doing local sourcing, it's trying to do still more by reaching out to parts of the country it didn't necessarily do before. It's also for menu items that historically would use imported foods, imported grains like rice, like a fried rice, for example, trying to experiment more with using locally sourced, even though it changes the taste some, just to see what the receptivity of customers are to these. And then given what I talked about fuel prices in the Nigerian market also, it's starting to look at alternative renewable sources of energy to complement what it already has in terms of grid and generator usage. Now it has also had to increase prices, and this the company grappled with for a while based on just the economic situation in the country, fear of losing volumes and traffic as a result, and competitive pressures, but it has had to do that.
Yeah.
Many of its competitors are also playing around with portion sizes, so they'll keep the headline price the same and reduce portions, but Sundry resists doing that because for this company, it feels like basically going back on what the customer promise and customer experience is. So it's committed to keeping the same quality, the same portions that customers are used to, and increasing prices cautiously.
Great, thanks, Nana. I think we're moving very much now into some of the opportunity space as well. I mean, it's a very dark backdrop, but at the same time, it's our role as a development finance institution to see how we can make a difference in that space. So some reflections from each of you, kicking off with you, Pindi, to say, what are the opportunities that perhaps we should be most excited about or most hopeful about in this space going forward, say, over the next year or so?
I think for the food space, agriculture space, we're looking at sustainability. And not just sustainability in terms of climate issues, but we also need to look at sustainability in terms of storage. I think there's a lot we can do with regards to storage facilities, additional capacity that goes hand in hand with that storage. We also need to look at distribution and logistics. I think we all know what happened in terms of COVID, where some of our clients, I actually mentioned 260 brands, but you find regional players actually suffered, like Lake Harvest, where because borders were closed, they were not able to move the produce. But even locally, I think we find in the agriculture sector that we still have to travel long distances, the producers, whether it's to go and get product from small-scale farmers, storage. So that area of distribution and logistics, there's a lot that can be done locally within the confines of the different regions that we operate in.
So an interesting point that you're making, Pindi, which is the agricultural value chain is not just about the products, but it's about the surrounding ecosystem and the logistics and services that needs to be remembered. I'm just mindful of time, so I want to make sure we also get to you, Nana, and then finally to you, William, about the opportunities that you now see, say, over the next 12 to 18 months. What makes you most hopeful in this space?
I think from our stance, for every country that we cover in the region, what you're seeing, in part based on the events of the last few years and just the need and imperative for food security, is that agri is reprioritized by all of these economies from policy standpoint, right? Where we recognize that this is not a nice to have anymore, it's an imperative. And so I think you have an alignment of stakeholders across the market, public and private, looking at this as an imperative. And I think as investors, to Pindi's point, what we should bring to the table is a holistic look at value chains, because as long as I have been alive, agri has been, to some extent, a stated priority in each of our countries. But what you see is interventions that address specific prongs of value chains and don't take a holistic value chain approach, and also less partnering than perhaps there should be across different stakeholder classes, because these are complex and nuanced issues, right? When you take every value chain, basically tomatoes, every year since I've been an adult, we have periods of glut, we have periods where we don't have them and are imported from Burkina Faso and paying astronomical prices. So it really needs to be a more holistic approach, to Pindi's point, across production, across storage, across logistics, all the way down to distribution, down to the last mile level, is the way we have to look at these issues. Because I do think that given how much arable land we have and generally favorable climatic conditions, there is a real opportunity here to substitute for some of these imports that we have, because you see time and again, situations like what Ghana is in now, in many of our countries, where we're simply importing too much, particularly on the food front. And there is really, the raw material is there to actually make good on what we have, to try to substitute some of these.
Great, thank you so much, Nana. Taking a more holistic look at the value chains and partnering with stakeholders. William, what makes you most hopeful in terms of opportunities in this space in East Africa?
Thanks a lot, Ilva. I think just speaking from what Pindi and Nana have just mentioned is about food systems. The way conversations are happening now is not specific, food products, but around the whole system. Soil health is an issue that has to be addressed in the continent, and conversations are going around that. I mentioned inputs before. Productivity in the continent is at bare minimums if you compare to other regions. And this is because we don't use the right seeds, we don't use the right fertilizer, the right quantities of fertilizer. Historically, people have been quite against use of fertilizers. I think these are things that currently, there's quite a lot of adoption, even at smallholder levels. So that makes me quite hopeful. storage, cold chains, warehouses, bags for smallholder farmers. I think these are investments that need to happen today. And there we've actually seen some companies approach us to partner with them in this kind of intervention, because post-harvest losses is about 30 to 40%. That is food that has already been produced in the continent that is going to waste. And who is paying for that? The farmers are taking the heat on it. And people lack food to eat. So I think that, for me, that's something that's almost a low-hanging fruit that is likely going to be addressed, and investments need to go into these areas. And this is, I think, where Norfund as an investor also plays a very critical role.
Great, thanks, William. Just a couple of final reflections, I think, on what we've heard. This is real. It's not just headlines in the newspapers, but it's being felt on the ground, and it's a roller coaster, as Nana talked about. We heard the story about the double squeeze of the farmer in the village of William's in-laws, where high input prices leads to him producing less, which leads to him then having to buy more. So it's really, really a double squeeze. For some of the companies, they're also feeling the increase of input prices. Sundry Foods in Nigeria is one example, 260 Brands in Zambia, but maybe also an upside for some of them with a shift from animal protein to vegetable protein that you talked about, Pindi, that perhaps there is an opportunity to increase sales as well in this challenging situation. Why do we eat Thai rice in Tanzania and Brazilian chicken in Mozambique? I think, William, you turned it around and said, that's definitely an opportunity. We need to build out more local opportunities and build more local resilience. And one of the ways of doing so is by more local supply chains, more diversification, and locally sourced foods. Finally, on the opportunities, we need to think more broadly about this. We need to think in terms of expanded value chains and ecosystems. It's not just about agri, as in a fruit or a vegetable, but it's really about storage, logistics, cold chains, looking across the value chain, and then also thinking that we need to do this with partners. It's not a solo game, this, but it's very much a team sport. And I think that's why we're all here. Yeah. So Pindi, Nana, William, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on what's happening on the ground, but also what are the opportunities that we'll be pursuing over the next year or so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.